Hello and welcome to another edition of our ETF Insight series, where we chat with innovative leaders from the ETF and digital assets ecosystem. Today, I'm very delighted to be joined by Fearghal Woods, who is Managing Director at JP Morgan. Welcome, Fearghal. Great to see you.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. Good to see you as well.
Thanks. So why don't we just kick it off and you tell us about your role at JP Morgan and what you do there?
So as you say, I'm Managing Director at JP Morgan. I am based here in Dublin. And I have a global role, which is head of our ETF servicing business. And that includes sort of the strategy for our ETF business, the sort of the development of our technology to support our ETF business, and the operating model that supports our clients globally across multiple different markets then on their ETF service environment. So it's been an interesting time and certainly interesting in terms of the growth we've experienced in the last couple of years.
And as you said, you're dealing with global clients and ETF issuers. And what trends are you seeing on that asset servicing side?
We're seeing trends in the market, and then we're seeing trends in the product side. So if I look at trends in the market, for example, a lot more conversations we're now seeing with active asset managers. So people who historically have not been in the ETF space before, and we're in the much more active management or mutual fund active strategies in the mutual fund side of things. There is much more interest now from those participants in terms of moving over towards ETFs. And I think the fact that we've seen such significant growth in the last number of years on the ETF side, the fact that we've over 50 months of consecutive inflows on the ETF side. And I think if you look even last year, you had net redemptions from the mutual fund side versus very significant over $500 billion in net subscriptions on the ETF side. That's got the attention of a lot of active managers now at this point. So I think people are investigating what are the benefits of doing some of the strategies we do in an ETF. So a lot of what we're seeing on the market side then is those active managers looking at either active transparent or active semi-transparent types of strategies. And that's globally as well. So a lot of those discussions in the US clearly, where we've seen market move now and some of those managers transition. We're also seeing that in places like Australia as well, where they're very actively looking at something similar in the Australian market. So you're probably a little bit behind that, but yeah, that's certainly a trend that we've seen, and definitely more of those active managers moving towards ETFs. I think then on the product side, you are seeing less, historically in the ETF side, you would have seen a lot of cap-weighted market index type products. And they, clearly they still have a significant amount of assets, but you are seeing much more thematic, much more sector type of ETFs and strategies come to market now. So some of the managers that are now coming are bringing very different strategies with them as well. So you're seeing a lot more activity in places you didn't historically see it in the ETF market. So I think, answering your question, you're seeing big sort of themes at the market side with managers looking in, and then that transitions or translates, I should say, even to, sector and different types of strategies that you see coming into the ETF market. So we're seeing both sides of that now. And as I say, very actively in some of the markets we're active in.
You had mentioned in the beginning there that, a lot of these active managers are, because we've seen all these flows into the ETF side, are starting to ask you questions about potentially entering the space. What would you say, we know the positives obviously, but what would you say would be some of the hurdles or a big hurdle for these firms entering into the market?
I don't think there's hurdles necessarily. I think there's probably, there's a misalignment of understanding about how ETFs work. And a lot of the discussions we get into are, how does the ecosystem work? How does the flow work? And particularly, how does the connectivity with market work and the listing work? So and the order taking process. So that whole authorized participant market maker sort of relationship is very new for people who have not been active in the space. So I think a lot of the questions we get tend to focus around those activities and, educating people as to how they will have to manage that relationship. And the whole role of a capital markets desk, which the ETF managers have, but you wouldn't see necessarily in a mutual fund management scenario. So I think a lot of the questions we get, when you say hurdles, a lot of the challenges for managers are understanding that process. When you talk about challenges of, whether I do it in a mutual fund or whether I do it in an ETF, there are, or whether I move my mutual fund into an ETF, we're seeing, as I say, when we're seeing a lot of people do that, there's practical challenges, I should say, just around getting things like shareholder consent. Like, am I going to create a new strategy or a new fund structure for the ETF and move assets across and shareholders across into it? Or am I going to transition the mutual fund that I have today into an ETF? And there's practical difficulties doing that, like, as I say, shareholder consent, changing constituent documents, adding in new agreements. there's a whole process around that. That's a lot of heavy lifting. What we've seen in market mostly, I think, is people transitioning to new structures. So create the ETF, agree with some of the investors they want more exposure on the ETF side, and then moving the assets and investors from the mutual fund, into the ETF side. So, and again, they work very similarly. It's just the mechanism by which you get in and out is slightly different. And I think people, once people understand that, it becomes much easier for them.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm, at Blackwater Search Advisory, a lot of the clients that we're talking to, I think once they come through with that, deciding, okay, here's the product we're going to create, there is that kind of a lot of questions around the cap markets and even distribution. And I know on the custody side, some people may just kind of associate, custodian firms with the TA, the fund accounting, the admin type role. But obviously, the way that you're talking, there's a lot of other things that you can provide guidance on for your clients. So what would you say would be some other areas that, your clients are coming to in terms of, consulting or guidance that they need when going through this process?
Yeah, I think a lot of them are coming on the structure and where best to, structure that, or, and even, they'll come to us on things like domicile as to why do we see more activity in one domicile over another. A lot of them will talk to us about, things like even share classes, like do we have an individual or, a specific share class, or do you have multiple currency share classes? Not necessarily in the US, but certainly in other markets, that becomes more of a feature of discussions. And again, a lot of that tends to be about how how the fund is sold, how the order execution works, and then how the whole settlement function works. So they're used to just shareholders directly coming in, applying to the transfer agent and getting a confirmation. This becomes much more of an active sort of, well, how does that settle? What markets do we need to settle it in? Where do we list it? So it becomes a much broader discussion in terms of where you list, where you domicile, what are the advantages of one over the other, and then actually your end-to-end processing model in terms of how do I deal with the APs? How much can you help me dealing with APs? How much information do I need to make available to them? When can I make that information available? And even right down to operating model, we have a lot of discussions around, okay, so let's go through a day in the life for you. What's the start of the day look like? And then walk us through, an order taking process, dealing with the AP, a settlement cycle, then the underlying basket settlement, and all of the interaction of those things, including all the data provision around them. So we literally talk from one end of that to the other. And a lot of our managers won't have, and certainly a lot of the discussions we've had more recently, they won't be that familiar with it. So that walking through a day in the life, including the participation of all the parties, is a really key discussion.
Yeah, and I'm sure I can imagine having watching people hear this for the first time. It's really obviously you're being able to help them through that process, because it certainly is not. It's definitely more complex, and there's a lot of nuances here, so it's great that you can help them with that. But Fearghal, thank you so much for your insights. This is really interesting. And if anyone wants to learn more about JP Morgan, they can reach out to Fearghal directly. And for Blackwater Search and Advisory, you can go to our website. Thank you. Thank you for watching.
Thanks for your time, Andrea. Thanks a lot. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks.